The silence in my basement apartment was broken only by the sound of footsteps above me, the click-clack of Corinne's designer heels against the hardwood floors. I knew she was pacing, agitated about tonight's dinner party. It was the third one this month, each more elaborate than the last, as she worked to impress potential high-end clients for her real estate business. Not that it mattered to me. I was expected to stay out of sight, like some modern-day Bertha Rochester hidden away in the basement of my own son's house. My son. The thought of Elliot still brought a mixture of love and disappointment that churned in my stomach. How had the sweet boy I raised become a man who would look the other way while his wife treated his mother like an unwelcome house guest? I glanced at the small digital clock on my nightstand. 4:30 p.m. Soon, the caterers would arrive, and Corinne would be too busy directing them to notice if I slipped upstairs to check on my herbs. I had a small collection growing in pots on the windowsill of what was once called the sunroom, but was now Corinne's meditation space. She tolerated my little garden because the fresh herbs made her look like a sophisticated hostess when guests commented on them. 38 years teaching biology to high schoolers in Burlington had given me a deep appreciation for growing things. My husband Richard and I had tended a half-acre garden at our old house, the one Elliot had convinced me to sell after Richard's aneurysm took him from me just 14 months ago. "It's too much house for you, Mom," he'd said. "Too many memories, too much maintenance." What he meant was that the house was worth too much money to let it sit occupied by just one aging widow. I eased myself up the stairs, my right knee protesting each step. The house was quiet now. Corinne must have gone to her bedroom to begin the lengthy process of preparing herself for the evening. I made it to the sunroom undetected and began examining my basil plants. They needed water. Someone had opened the window and the soil had dried out faster than usual. As I was filling the small watering can at the kitchen sink, I heard them. "She can't join us tonight, Elliot. I don't care if Dr. Hadley was her colleague. These are important clients, not a faculty mixer." I froze, water overflowing onto my hand. Dr. Patricia Hadley and her husband were coming tonight? Patricia had been my department head for 15 years, a dear friend who had sent me 3 condolence cards after Richard died, each one containing a different variety of rare seed packets. I hadn't seen her since moving in with Elliot. "She's my mother, Corinne." Elliot's voice had that placating tone I'd come to recognize, the one that signaled his imminent surrender. "She's been alone in that basement all week while we were in Lake Placid. It would mean a lot to her. And this dinner could mean a 7-figure commission to us. The Westons are looking at 3 properties over $2 million each, and the Hadleys' endorsement matters to them." Corinne's voice dropped to a hiss. "Your mother wears the same 3 outfits in rotation and talks about plant cellular structures to anyone who'll listen. She doesn't fit with the image we're presenting." I set the watering can down quietly, my hands trembling not from age, but from anger. I was about to announce my presence when Corinne continued. "Besides, the money from her house is almost gone. You said it yourself, the investment opportunity you put it in isn't performing. We can't afford to jeopardize this deal." A cold sensation spread through my chest. The money from my house, all $387,000 of it, after paying off the remaining mortgage, was gone? Elliot had assured me he was investing it conservatively, that it would supplement my modest teacher's pension and small Social Security check. I'd only been living here for 10 months. "That's not what I said," Elliot replied, his voice strained. "I said we need to diversify because the initial investment, whatever. The point is, we're carrying her now, and I'm not letting her peculiarities ruin this opportunity. She stays downstairs tonight." End of discussion. I heard the distinctive sound of Corinne's footsteps retreating, followed by Elliot's heavier tread and a door closing somewhere upstairs. I stood frozen in place, the implications of what I'd just heard washing over me like ice water. My son had lost my money, or worse, spent it, and neither of them had planned to tell me. I abandoned the herbs and returned to my basement apartment, mind racing. The space suddenly felt like the cage it was, a converted basement with low ceilings, small windows that let in minimal light, and the persistent smell of laundry detergent from the adjacent utility room. I'd accepted it gratefully, believing it was temporary until I got back on my feet emotionally, as Elliot had put it. Now I understood. There had never been a plan for me to leave. I was expected to stay here, dependent and invisible, a convenient babysitter for my grandchildren, and nothing more. With shaking hands, I opened my laptop, a gift from my former students upon my retirement. I logged into my bank account, something I'd done less frequently since Elliot had taken over managing my finances. The balance in my checking account was as expected. My modest pension had been deposited 3 days ago. But when I tried to access the investment account Elliot had set up, my password was rejected. 3 failed attempts later, I sat back, a cold fury replacing my initial shock. I had been locked out of my own money. I needed to see documentation, something concrete that would either confirm my fears or put them to rest. Moving as quietly as I could, I made my way back upstairs and down the hall to Elliot's home office. The door was unlocked. Why would he lock it? He never expected his compliant mother to snoop. The desk was impeccably organized, just as I'd taught him to keep his homework space as a child. I hesitated only briefly before pulling open the top drawer. Inside were neatly labeled folders. One caught my eye immediately. Mom's Investments. The folder contained statements from an investment firm I didn't recognize. As I scanned the documents, my educator's eye quickly spotted the pattern: increasingly large withdrawals, transactions to accounts with vague labels like ENC Property Holdings and Lakeview Development Opportunity. The most recent statement showed a balance of just under $42,000, barely a tenth of what should have been there. A sound from the hallway sent me scrambling to return the folder and close the drawer. I slipped back downstairs just as the doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of the caterers. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, thoughts churning. Elliot had always been driven by a desire to impress, to achieve status. It had made him a diligent student, but a people-pleaser as an adult. And Corinne, beautiful, status-conscious Corinne, had capitalized on that weakness from the moment they'd met at a charity fundraiser 6 years ago. I had sold my home, my garden, and most of my possessions, believing I was helping secure my future while not burdening my son. Instead, I had funded their lifestyle and social climbing, becoming nothing more than an inconvenience to be hidden away. At 65, I was not yet ready for this to be my life. The sounds of preparation continued above me. Furniture being moved, voices directing, the occasional clatter of serving dishes. I sat still, formulating a plan. I would need documentation, legal advice, and somewhere to go. I couldn't confront Elliot with just suspicions. I needed proof and protection. Around 6:30, there was a knock at my door. Elliot stood there, looking uncomfortable in an expensive suit that seemed a size too small across his shoulders. "Mom, I know you heard Corinne earlier. I'm sorry about that." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, not quite meeting my eyes. "She's just stressed about tonight. The Westons are big potential clients." I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "I understand, Elliot. Important business connections come first." Relief flooded his features. So eager was he to avoid conflict that he missed the bitterness in my tone. "Thanks for understanding, Mom. But hey, I was thinking, why don't you join us for dessert around 9:30 after the business talk is done? Patricia Hadley asked about you specifically when I called to confirm." I recognized the offering for what it was, a small concession he could make without defying Corinne completely. "That would be lovely, thank you." Elliot smiled, already backing toward the stairs. "Great. Just, maybe wear that blue dress Dad bought you for your last anniversary." Corinne mentioned it was nice. After he left, I sat perfectly still, breathing through the anger. Corinne had mentioned my dress was nice. High praise indeed from a woman who spent more on a single handbag than my monthly pension. At precisely 9:25, I emerged from the basement wearing the blue dress, the one Richard had saved for months to buy me from a boutique in Montreal for our 35th anniversary. I'd paired it with the pearl earrings he'd given me on our wedding day and applied makeup for the first time in months. If I was to be the poor widow on display, I would at least look the part they wanted. The dinner party was in full swing, the dining room filled with the sounds of animated conversation and the clink of expensive crystal. I paused in the doorway, instantly spotting Patricia Hadley's silver bob across the room. Before I could approach her, Corinne intercepted me, champagne flute in hand and a tight smile on her face. "June, you look refreshed." Her eyes performed a quick assessment, finding little to criticize in my appearance, but communicating her displeasure at my presence nonetheless. We're just about to serve the poached pears. Why don't you help yourself to a plate in the kitchen first, and then join us? The implication was clear. I wasn't to serve myself at the table with the guests. I was to eat separately, then join them as if I'd already dined. Thank you, Corinne, but I'm not particularly hungry. I moved past her toward Patricia, who had noticed me and was waving enthusiastically. The next hour passed in a blur of pleasant conversation with my former colleague and careful navigation around Corinne's attempts to minimize my interactions with the other guests. I spoke with Patricia about her latest research project involving local watershed conservation, met her husband who had retired from his dental practice, and was introduced to the Westons, the potential clients Corinne was so eager to impress. Mrs. Weston, it turned out, had been an avid gardener before moving to their high-rise condo in Boston. Elliot tells us you're quite the botanist, she said warmly. I miss my garden terribly. What are you growing these days? Before I could respond, Corinne smoothly interjected. June has the sweetest little herb garden in the sunroom. Just a few pots, but it's a nice hobby for her. Speaking of green spaces, the lakeside property we discussed has the most magnificent landscaped grounds. And just like that, I was sidelined from the conversation. I retreated to the edge of the room, observing the dynamics at play. Elliot hovered near Corinne, refilling drinks and laughing too loudly at Mr. Weston's jokes. Patricia kept glancing my way with concern. She had known me long enough to sense something was wrong. As the evening was winding down, dessert plates were cleared, and I made my way to the kitchen to help the catering staff, more comfortable in their company than with the guests. I was placing dessert forks in the dishwasher when Corinne entered, her face flushed with triumph. They're signing tomorrow, she whispered excitedly to Elliot, who had followed her in. All 3 properties. That's nearly $200,000 in commissions. That's great, honey. Elliot looked genuinely relieved, the tension he'd been carrying in his shoulders all evening finally releasing. I told you, having Mom join for dessert wouldn't be a problem. Corinne's smile faltered slightly. Yes, well, fortunately she didn't monopolize Patricia with talk about her precious plants. She glanced over, noticing me for the first time. Oh, June, you don't need to do that. The caterers are paid to clean up. I continued rinsing a plate, not trusting myself to respond politely. One of the catering staff, a young woman with vibrant tattoos covering her arms, gave me a small smile of solidarity. Actually, Corinne continued, lowering her voice but not enough. Why don't you take a plate down to your room? You must be hungry since you didn't eat with us. I'm fine, thank you, I replied, my voice steady despite the churning in my stomach. Don't be silly. You've barely eaten all day. Here. She grabbed a dessert plate and hastily scooped a serving of the poached pear and a small piece of chocolate torte onto it. Take this downstairs before the Westons see you working like the help. I accepted the plate mechanically, years of conditioning to keep the peace overriding my desire to refuse. As I turned to leave, Mrs. Weston appeared in the kitchen doorway. Oh, June, there you are. I wanted to ask you about that conservation project Patricia mentioned. My foundation is looking for new environmental initiatives to support in New England, and Corinne cut her off with a practiced laugh. I'm afraid you've caught June having her little midnight snack. She prefers to eat in her room, don't you, June? Her tone was light, conversational, but her eyes were hard as she looked at me. I stood frozen, the plate in my hand suddenly feeling like a brand of shame. Mrs. Weston looked confused, her gaze moving from me to Corinne and back again. I was just helping with the dishes, I said quietly. Dishes? But the caterers. Mrs. Weston trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. Corinne laughed again, the sound brittle. June loves to be useful, but she should really be resting. Doctor's orders after her fall last year. She turned to me, her smile not reaching her eyes. And honestly, June, you really shouldn't eat like that. You eat like a beggar. It's embarrassing. No wonder Elliot grew up with such poor table manners. The silence that followed was absolute. The young caterer stopped stacking plates, her eyes wide. Mrs. Weston's mouth opened slightly in shock. Even Elliot, always quick to smooth over his wife's sharp edges, stood speechless. In that moment, something inside me, something that had been bending and accommodating for months, finally broke. I set the plate down carefully on the counter. I believe I'll turn in for the night, I said, my voice remarkably steady. It was lovely to see you again, Patricia. Mrs. Weston, I hope you find a worthy conservation project for your foundation. Perhaps Patricia can recommend something suitable. I walked out of the kitchen with my head high, feeling Corinne's glare and Elliot's discomfort like physical forces at my back. In my basement room, I closed the door and leaned against it, finally allowing the tears to come. Not tears of hurt, but of rage and resolve. By morning, I would be gone. And by the time they realized what I knew about my missing money, it would be too late to stop me from taking back control of what remained of my life. I spent the night methodically packing a single suitcase with essentials, clothes, medications, and the few mementos I'd kept when selling my house. Into a separate tote bag went my laptop, important documents, and a small photo album. I worked in near silence, listening to the sounds of the party ending above me, then the murmur of Elliot and Corinne's voices as they prepared for bed. At 5:30 a.m., I placed an envelope on my neatly made bed. Inside was a note that read simply, "I refuse to be invisible any longer. Do not try to contact me." I took one last look at the basement that had been my prison for the past 10 months, then quietly climbed the stairs and walked out the front door into the cool Vermont morning. The sun was just beginning to illuminate the green mountains in the distance as I wheeled my suitcase down the perfect suburban street. For the first time since Richard's death, I felt something like hope stirring in my chest. I had no illusions about the difficult path ahead. At 65, starting over would not be easy. But as a biology teacher, I had always taught my students that adaptation was the key to survival. And I was nothing if not adaptable. The first motel I checked into was a dingy establishment on the outskirts of Burlington, the kind of place that asked few questions when an older woman paid for 3 nights in cash. The room smelled of industrial cleaner, barely masking decades of cigarette smoke, but it had a lock on the door and was far enough from Elliot's neighborhood that I wouldn't be easily found. I sat on the edge of the bed, the springs protesting beneath me, and opened my laptop. My teacher's pension had been deposited the previous week, $1,283 after taxes. It wasn't much, but it was something they couldn't touch. I had withdrawn $500 in cash before leaving, enough to cover this room and basic necessities until I formulated a better plan. I needed professional help, but I had to be careful. Elliot worked with several of the accountants and financial advisors in Burlington. If I approached the wrong person, word could get back to him before I had secured what remained of my money. My phone buzzed incessantly throughout that first day. Elliot calling, then texting with escalating urgency. "Mom, where are you? Please call me." "Mom, I'm worried. Whatever Corinne said, she didn't mean it. This isn't funny anymore. The police won't file a missing persons report for 24 hours, but I'm going to contact hospitals if you don't respond." I turned the phone off after that last message. The manipulation was textbook. First concern, then minimizing his wife's behavior, finally the veiled threat of embarrassing me with authorities. I would not be swayed. The motel had spotty Wi-Fi, but it was sufficient for research. I spent hours reading about financial elder abuse, learning that what had happened to me was not uncommon. Adult children taking advantage of aging parents, especially widows. It was a story told thousands of times across America every year. By evening, I had compiled a list of resources: a legal aid clinic specializing in elder issues, the Vermont Attorney General's Elder Protection Initiative, and several names of attorneys who offered free initial consultations. I would start making calls in the morning. Sleep eluded me that night. Every unfamiliar sound from the parking lot jolted me awake. Car doors slamming, voices arguing, the rumble of trucks on the nearby highway. In the darkest hours before dawn, doubt crept in. Had I overreacted? Could there be an innocent explanation for the withdrawals from my account? Was I throwing away my relationship with my only child over a misunderstanding? Then I remembered Corinne's words, spoken with such casual cruelty in front of strangers. "You eat like a beggar," and Elliot standing silent beside her, unwilling to defend his own mother. No, I had not overreacted. I had finally reacted. Morning brought a renewed sense of purpose. I showered in the lukewarm water, dressed in one of my few remaining professional outfits, and walked to the diner across the parking lot. Over a cup of coffee that tasted of burnt grounds and a dry piece of toast, I made my first call. Vermont Legal Aid, Elder Law Project. This is Heather speaking. 2 hours later, I sat across from Heather Reeves in a small but tidy office near the courthouse. She was younger than I had expected, perhaps early 60s, with short gray hair and intelligent eyes behind purple-framed glasses. A social worker by training, she had spent the last 15 years advocating for older adults facing exploitation. Unfortunately, what you're describing is a textbook case of financial exploitation by family members, she said after I had explained my situation. The good news is that you've acted quickly. Many victims don't realize what's happening until all their assets are gone. She tapped her pen against a yellow legal pad. Do you have copies of the account statements you found? No, I admitted. I only saw them briefly before I had to replace them in the drawer. That's our first challenge then. Without documentation, it's harder to take legal action. She leaned forward. Tell me, Mrs. Barrett. June, please. June, do you still have online access to any accounts? Email where statements might have been sent? I shook my head. Elliot set everything up after I sold the house. He said it would be easier if he handled the finances while I was grieving. I paused, embarrassment washing over me. I realize now how foolish that was. Not foolish, Heather corrected firmly. Trusting. There's a difference. And what happened is not your fault. It's a betrayal of that trust. For the next hour, we developed a strategy. First, I would need to secure my pension by redirecting future deposits to a new bank account that Elliot couldn't access. Then, we would file a complaint with the Attorney General's office and send a formal demand letter to Elliot for a full accounting of my funds. What about the police? I asked. Isn't this theft? Heather's expression grew somber. It can be prosecuted as such, yes. But family financial exploitation cases are complicated. If Elliot claims you gave him permission to use the money, which he likely will, it becomes a civil rather than criminal matter in many jurisdictions. I left her office with a folder of forms to complete and an appointment to return in 2 days. The weight on my shoulders felt marginally lighter. I had an ally now, someone who believed me and knew how to fight. Back at the motel, I turned my phone on briefly to check messages. 23 missed calls, 18 from Elliot, 3 from unknown numbers, and 2 from Patricia Hadley. I listened to Patricia's voicemail. June, it's Patricia. I've been trying to reach you. Elliot called asking if I'd heard from you. He seems concerned, but, well, after what I witnessed at that dinner party, I can imagine why you might need space. Call me if you need anything. Anything at all. I texted her a brief reply. I'm safe but need time. We'll explain later. Please don't tell Elliot you've heard from me. Then I turned the phone off again. That evening, as I was returning to my room with a sandwich from a nearby deli, I noticed a police cruiser in the motel parking lot. The officer was showing my picture to the clerk at the front desk. Elliot had made good on his threat to involve authorities. I ducked behind a vending machine, heart pounding. The clerk was shaking his head, whether honestly denying my presence or protecting my privacy, I couldn't tell. After what felt like an eternity, the officer returned to his vehicle and drove away. I slipped back to my room using the side entrance, pulse racing. I needed to move. Even if the clerk hadn't identified me this time, Elliot would eventually think to check low-budget motels. I quickly packed my few belongings, left cash to cover my stay under the room key, and called a taxi. Greyhound Station, please, I told the driver when he arrived. 20 minutes later, I stood in the fluorescent-lit bus terminal, studying the departure board. I needed somewhere Elliot wouldn't think to look, somewhere I could stay while fighting to reclaim my money and my dignity. The 9:15 p.m. to Montreal caught my eye. Canada was tempting, a different country, a different system where Elliot would have less reach. But no, crossing a border might complicate my legal battle. I needed to stay within reach of Vermont courts. 1 ticket to Albany, I decided, approaching the counter. New York was close enough to return for legal appointments, but far enough that Elliot was unlikely to search there immediately. The overnight bus was half empty, allowing me a row to myself. As we pulled away from Burlington, the city lights receding into the darkness, a complex emotion swept through me. Grief for what I had lost, mixed with a fierce determination to survive this betrayal. In Albany, I found a women's hostel that offered weekly rates. The shared room with 3 other women wasn't ideal, but it was clean and secure. My roommates were an eclectic group. Maya, a 20-something backpacker from Germany, Dorothy, a grandmother in her 70s who had lost her home to foreclosure, and Tanya, a quiet woman in her 40s who kept to herself. Dorothy and I formed an immediate bond, two older women adrift in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to aging females without wealth or family support. My son-in-law convinced my daughter I was becoming senile, Dorothy confided one evening as we shared tea in the hostel's common room. Had some doctor friend of his write up an evaluation without even examining me properly. Next thing I know, they're getting power of attorney and selling my house out from under me. Said they were doing it for my own good, that I couldn't manage alone anymore. What did you do? I asked, recognizing the painful parallels to my own situation. Fought like hell, she said simply. Got myself to a different doctor who certified I was perfectly competent. Found a legal aid lawyer who took the case pro bono. We're in court now. Meanwhile, I'm here. She gestured around the hostel. Not where I expected to be at 73, but I'm not giving up. Her resilience inspired me. If Dorothy could fight back after losing everything, so could I. After 3 days in Albany, I returned to Burlington for my follow-up appointment with Heather. I took precautions, wearing a scarf over my hair, using buses instead of taxis, and arriving at the legal aid office through the back entrance. Heather had news. We've made progress, she said, gesturing for me to sit. I contacted the investment firm directly, using your social security number and identification to establish you as the account holder. They were reluctant at first, but when I mentioned potential elder abuse and regulatory complaints, they became more cooperative. She slid a folder across the desk. Inside were account statements, the complete history of the investment account Elliot had opened with my house proceeds. It's worse than you thought, Heather said gently. The withdrawals started almost immediately after the account was funded. I flipped through the pages, my hands trembling. Large transfers to E&C Property Holdings, Elliot and Corinne's real estate investment company. Withdrawals coded as management fees. A $42,000 transfer labeled Lakefront Project Phase 1. All told, of the original $387,000, only $28,452.17 remained. They were using my money to fund their real estate side business, I said, the reality sinking in. All those properties Corinne was always talking about flipping and developing, they were buying them with my retirement money. Heather nodded grimly. And based on these statements, most of the investments aren't performing well. There are margin calls, emergency cash infusions. They've been robbing Peter to pay Paul, using new investments to cover losses on earlier ones. A Ponzi scheme, I murmured, the term surfacing from some news article I'd read years ago. Something like that, yes. And now we have proof. She tapped the statements. With these, we can file for an emergency freeze on the remaining funds, then pursue recovery of what was taken. Will I get it all back? Heather's hesitation told me everything. We'll try, June. But if they've spent it or the investments have genuinely lost value, there may not be much to recover. I sat back, the full weight of the situation crushing down on me. Nearly everything I had worked for over a lifetime of teaching, gone. My home, my security, my future independence, all sacrificed to fund my son's and his wife's aspirations and lifestyle. There's more, Heather said, interrupting my thoughts. Your son filed a report with Adult Protective Services yesterday, claiming you're mentally incapacitated and wandered away from home. He's seeking an emergency guardianship order. The room seemed to tilt. He's trying to have me declared incompetent? It appears so. Fortunately, these kinds of rushed guardianships are being scrutinized more carefully these days. The court will appoint an independent evaluator and will make sure you're assessed fairly. How could he do this? The question escaped me before I could stop it. Not a legal query, but the anguished cry of a mother whose child had betrayed her so completely. Heather didn't offer platitudes. Instead, she reached across the desk and briefly squeezed my hand. I don't know, June. But what I do know is that we're going to fight this with everything we've got. I left the legal aid office with a list of next steps and an appointment with a geriatric psychiatrist who would evaluate me and provide testimony countering Elliot's claims of incompetence. I also had the name of a place where I might stay, a women's transitional housing program for those over 55 facing homelessness due to financial exploitation or abuse. As I waited at the bus stop to return to Albany, a black SUV pulled up alongside me. The passenger window rolled down, revealing Elliot's face, tight with anger and something else. Fear, perhaps. "Mom, get in the car, now." I stepped back from the curb, clutching my purse tightly. "No, Elliot, I'm not going anywhere with you." He shoved the car door open. "This is ridiculous. You can't just disappear like this. Do you have any idea what you've put me through? The police, the missing persons report. I had to take time off work." His concern was for himself, I noted. Not for my well-being, not for where I'd been sleeping or if I was safe, just the inconvenience I'd caused him. "I know what you did with my money, Elliot, all of it. The legal aid office has copies of the statements." His face paled, then flushed with anger. "What are you talking about? I've been investing your money exactly as we discussed. If you'd bothered to ask, instead of running off like a what, Elliot? Like a beggar?" I interrupted, Corinne's cruel words still fresh in my mind. He had the decency to look ashamed, at least momentarily. Corinne shouldn't have said that. She was stressed about the clients. She apologized to me afterward. To you, not to me. I shook my head. "And now you're trying to have me declared incompetent? Your own mother?" "It's not like that," he protested, glancing around nervously as people at the bus stop began to take notice of our confrontation. "It's for your own protection. You're not thinking clearly. After Dad died, you've been different, emotional, making rash decisions. Like noticing when almost $400,000 disappears from my account?" My voice was steady, loud enough for others to hear. "That kind of rash decision?" Elliot's jaw tightened. "Get in the car, Mom. We can discuss this privately." "No." I took another step back as the bus approached. "I'll see you in court, Elliot. And I suggest you get a good lawyer. You're going to need one." As I boarded the bus, I glanced back to see him standing on the sidewalk, fists clenched at his sides, face contorted with a mixture of rage and panic. For the first time, I saw him clearly, not as my son, the little boy I had raised, but as the man he had become, selfish, entitled, and willing to destroy his own mother to maintain his lifestyle and appease his wife. The realization should have broken my heart, but instead, it hardened my resolve. This was no longer just about recovering my money. It was about justice, dignity, and refusing to be discarded by a society that saw aging women as expendable, invisible, and easy prey. Back in Albany, I shared the developments with Dorothy, who listened with growing outrage. "The guardianship attempt is the most dangerous part," she warned. "Once they get control legally, it's nearly impossible to break free. You need to stay away from Burlington until after your psychiatric evaluation. If they find you before then, they could force you into a facility for observation." That night, unable to sleep despite my exhaustion, I slipped out to the hostel's small courtyard. The spring air was cool, the sky clear enough to see a few stars despite the city lights. I thought of my classroom at Burlington High, where for decades I had taught teenagers about adaptation and survival, how organisms evolve to meet challenges in their environments. Now I was being tested, forced to adapt to a hostile landscape I never expected to navigate. But I was still a scientist at heart. I would observe, analyze, and find a way to not just survive, but thrive again. The next morning, I called Patricia Hadley from a payphone at the bus station. "June, thank God. Are you all right? Where are you?" Her voice was thick with worry. "I'm safe, but I can't tell you where. Elliot is trying to have me declared incompetent." "What? That's absurd. You're one of the sharpest minds I know. He and Corinne have taken most of my money from the house sale. When I confronted him, this was his response." There was a moment of silence. Then Patricia said, "Tell me what you need. Anything. A place to stay in Burlington for a few days next week. I have a psychiatric evaluation on Tuesday that will hopefully put an end to this guardianship nonsense. But I can't risk staying at a hotel where Elliot might find me. Stay with us," she offered immediately. "Our guest room is yours for as long as you need it. Robert and I will pick you up wherever you want." Relief flooded through me. "Thank you, Patricia. But you should know, associating with me might put you in an awkward position. Elliot and Corinne are telling people I'm having a mental breakdown. Patricia's laugh was short and sharp. Let them try that line with me. I've known you for 30 years, June. I've seen you handle everything from school board politics to your husband's illness with more grace and rationality than most could muster. Anyone who believes you're suddenly incompetent is a fool. We arranged for her to pick me up at the train station the following Monday. As I hung up, a weight lifted from my shoulders. I had allies in this fight. Professionals like Heather who understood the legal landscape, friends like Patricia who believed in me, and even strangers like Dorothy who had walked similar paths. I was not alone, and I was not going to disappear quietly. That night, as I prepared for bed in the hostel's shared bathroom, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was thinner, her eyes shadowed with fatigue, but there was something else there too, a steely determination that reminded me of my mother in her later years. "You don't look like a beggar to me," I whispered to my reflection, reclaiming the word that had been meant to wound me. "You look like a survivor." And survivors, as I had taught my biology students for decades, are those who adapt, who evolve, who find new ways to thrive when the old ways no longer serve. I might have lost my home, much of my savings, and even my relationship with my only child, but I had not lost myself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, legal battles, financial uncertainty, the emotional toll of fighting my own son. But tonight, in this quiet moment of clarity, I knew with absolute certainty that I would emerge from this ordeal stronger than before. The woman who had meekly moved into her son's basement no longer existed. In her place stood someone far more dangerous to Elliot and Corinne's schemes, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. The Hadleys' home in Burlington's historic hill section was everything my basement prison was not: open, airy, filled with light and the scent of blooming jasmine from their greenhouse. Patricia and Robert welcomed me with a fierce protectiveness that brought tears to my eyes. They had prepared the guest room with fresh linens, stocked the attached bathroom with new toiletries, and even placed a small vase of early spring flowers on the nightstand. "No one knows you're here except us," Patricia assured me as she showed me around. "And our security system was just upgraded last month." I hadn't considered that Elliot might physically try to remove me once he found me, but Patricia's precautions made me realize the possibility was real. If he was desperate enough to seek guardianship, what else might he do? "I've taken the liberty of contacting a former student of mine," Patricia continued as we settled in their sunroom with tea. "Diane Morales. She works for the Attorney General's office in the Financial Crimes Division. She's agreed to meet with us tomorrow, unofficially." Robert, a retired physics professor with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, joined us. "And I've spoken with my brother-in-law. He's a retired judge who still has connections in the family court. He's making some inquiries about this guardianship petition." Their immediate mobilization of resources on my behalf was overwhelming. For months, I had been treated as an inconvenience, a burden, someone whose needs and dignity were secondary. Now suddenly, I was surrounded by people who saw me, truly saw me, and were outraged on my behalf. That evening, as we were finishing dinner, Patricia's phone rang. Her expression grew serious as she listened to the caller. "I understand. Yes, she's here with us. One moment." She covered the mouthpiece and looked at me. "It's Heather Reeves. There's been a development." I took the phone with trembling hands. "Heather, what's happened?" "The court has scheduled an emergency hearing on the guardianship petition for tomorrow at 9 a.m. Elliot's lawyer is pushing for immediate temporary guardianship pending the full evaluation. We need to be there to contest it." My stomach dropped. "So soon? But my psychiatric evaluation isn't until next week." "That's exactly why they're pushing for this now. They're hoping to get temporary guardianship before you can be professionally evaluated. Once they have even temporary control, they can force you into a facility of their choosing for observation." The implications were chilling. If Elliot gained even temporary guardianship, he could legally control where I lived, what medical treatment I received, and who I could contact. He could isolate me completely while continuing to drain what remained of my finances. "I'll be there," I said firmly. "Good. Wear something conservative and professional. First impressions matter with family court judges." After hanging up, I explained the situation to Patricia and Robert. Without hesitation, Patricia said, "I'm coming with you. The court should hear from someone who's known you professionally for decades." That night, sleep eluded me despite the comfortable bed. I kept thinking of Elliot as a child, how he had once brought me dandelions clutched in his small fist, insisting they were too pretty to be called weeds. When had that sensitive boy transformed into a man who would try to have his own mother declared incompetent for financial gain? Morning came too quickly. I dressed in a navy blue suit that Patricia had lent me, applied minimal makeup, and pulled my silver hair back in a neat bun. The woman in the mirror looked composed, dignified, professional. Nothing like the doddering, unstable person Elliot was presumably describing to the court. The courthouse was an imposing limestone building in downtown Burlington. As we approached the entrance, I spotted Elliot and Corinne standing near the doors with a man in an expensive suit, their lawyer, presumably. Elliot's eyes widened in surprise when he saw me, then narrowed as he noted Patricia at my side. We managed to enter without direct confrontation, but in the hallway outside the courtroom, Elliot broke away from his group and approached us. "Mom, stop this nonsense now," he hissed, keeping his voice low. "You're embarrassing yourself and dragging our family problems into public view." I looked at my son, this stranger wearing Elliot's face, and felt a curious detachment. "You tried to have me declared incompetent behind my back. You stole my money, and I'm the one causing embarrassment." His face flushed. "I never stole anything. I was investing your money for your benefit, and this disappearing act only proves you're not thinking clearly. What kind of rational person abandons their home without warning? What kind of rational person stays in a home where they're treated like a servant and told they eat like a beggar?" I countered, my voice steady. A flicker of shame crossed his features, quickly replaced by defensive anger. Corinne apologized for that comment. "You're blowing everything out of proportion because you're not emotionally stable right now. Dad's death hit you harder than you'll admit." Before I could respond, a woman in a sharp charcoal suit approached us. "Mrs. Barrett, I'm Layla Gonzalez from Vermont Legal Aid. Heather Reeves asked me to represent you today." Elliot's eyes darted between us. "You got a lawyer?" "Mom, this is ridiculous. We're family. We shouldn't need lawyers to talk to each other." "And yet, you brought one," I noted, nodding toward the man standing with Corinne, who was watching our interaction with thinly veiled hostility. Elliot opened his mouth to respond, but at that moment the courtroom doors opened, and the bailiff called our case. The hearing room was smaller than I expected, more intimate than the grand courtrooms depicted on television. Judge Marion Harrington, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, presided from a modest bench. Her sharp eyes took in everyone as we entered and took our places. Elliot's lawyer spoke first, painting a picture of a grieving widow whose mental state had deteriorated following her husband's death. He described my erratic behavior, selling my home, then suddenly disappearing without warning, refusing contact with family. He emphasized Elliot's concern for my welfare and safety, presenting my son as a devoted child, seeking only to protect his vulnerable mother. When it was Ms. Gonzalez's turn, she systematically dismantled this narrative. She introduced the investment account statements showing the systematic draining of my funds. She presented my teaching evaluations from my final years before retirement, showing a highly competent professional. She called Patricia to testify about our recent interactions, establishing my clear mental acuity. "Your Honor, this is not a case of a son concerned for his mother's welfare," Ms. Gonzalez concluded. "This is a textbook case of financial elder abuse, followed by an attempt to silence the victim through a guardianship proceeding. Mrs. Barrett is not incompetent, she is inconvenient. She has discovered the financial exploitation and is taking steps to address it." Judge Harrington's expression remained neutral throughout, giving no indication of her thoughts. When both sides had presented their cases, she removed her glasses and addressed the court. "I've seen a disturbing increase in these types of cases in recent years," she said, her voice firm. "Adult children seeking guardianship of parents shortly after those parents have come into money or assets. It's a troubling pattern." Elliot shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Based on the evidence presented today, I am denying the petition for emergency temporary guardianship. Mrs. Barrett appears fully competent to manage her own affairs." The judge's gaze fixed on Elliot. "Furthermore, I am ordering a freeze on all accounts containing Mrs. Barrett's funds, pending a full forensic accounting." Relief washed over me, so intense I nearly swayed in my seat. Additionally, the judge continued, I am referring this matter to the Financial Crimes Division of the Attorney General's Office for investigation of possible elder financial abuse. This court takes such matters extremely seriously. Elliot's face had gone pale. Corinne, seated behind him, looked as though she might be sick. As we exited the courtroom, Ms. Gonzalez touched my arm. This is just the beginning, Mrs. Barrett. The financial recovery process will take time, and there may be criminal proceedings depending on what the AG's office finds. Are you prepared for that? Was I prepared to see my only child potentially face criminal charges? The question sent a wave of conflicting emotions through me. Despite everything, some part of me still remembered Elliot as my little boy, the child who had cried when he accidentally stepped on a caterpillar, who had defended smaller kids from bullies in elementary school. But I also saw clearly the man he had become, someone who would steal from his own mother, then try to have her declared incompetent to cover his tracks. I'm prepared, I said finally. Justice has to matter more than family loyalty when the family has betrayed that loyalty so completely. Ms. Gonzalez nodded with understanding. Heather will continue working with you on the financial recovery. Meanwhile, you should consider where you'll live long term. The Women's Transitional Housing Program has space available if you need it. As we discussed next steps, I became aware of a commotion near the courthouse entrance. Corinne was engaged in a heated argument with Elliot and their lawyer, her voice rising despite the lawyer's attempts to quiet her. "This is your fault," she hissed at Elliot, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You said she'd never figure it out. You said the guardianship would be easy to get." Elliot grabbed her arm, trying to steer her toward the exit, but she wrenched away from him. "Don't touch me. Everything we've built is falling apart because you couldn't control your mother." Their lawyer was frantically trying to silence her, but Corinne was beyond caring about appearances now. "The lakefront project is already underwater, and now this. Where are we supposed to get the money to pay back what you took? We can't even make the mortgage this month." The public airing of their financial desperation drew stares from everyone in the hallway. Elliot finally managed to hustle Corinne outside, but the damage was done. Their carefully constructed facade of successful professionals concerned about a declining parent had cracked, revealing the desperate, grasping reality beneath. Patricia, who had witnessed the entire scene, placed a supportive hand on my shoulder. "Let's get you back to our place. This has been enough drama for one day." But the day's revelations weren't over. When we returned to the Hadleys' home, Diane Morales from the Attorney General's office was waiting for us. A sharp-eyed woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked black hair, she had the focused intensity of someone who had spent her career pursuing financial criminals. "The judge called me directly after your hearing," she explained as we settled in the Hadleys' living room. "What I'm about to tell you isn't public information yet, but you should be prepared." She opened a folder containing what appeared to be bank statements and property records. "Your son and daughter-in-law aren't just stealing from you, Mrs. Barrett. They're running a real estate investment scheme that has defrauded at least 7 other investors, most of them elderly or vulnerable in some way." The shock must have shown on my face because she continued more gently. "The pattern is consistent. They identify potential investors, often older individuals with substantial assets but limited investment knowledge. They promise high returns on exclusive property development opportunities. They use just enough of the investment to make cosmetic improvements to properties, stage elaborate sales events, then claim market downturns or unexpected complications when the promised returns don't materialize." "How much?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Conservatively? Close to $2 million over the past 3 years. Your money appears to be the most recent infusion into their scheme." The room seemed to tilt around me. Elliot wasn't just stealing from me. He was a serial financial predator who had targeted multiple vulnerable people, and I had raised him. Where had I gone so wrong? "We've been building a case for months," Diane continued. "Your situation has accelerated our timeline. We'll be executing search warrants for their financial records tomorrow morning." Robert Hadley spoke up. "What does this mean for June's chances of recovering her money?" Diane's expression was somber. "It complicates things. On one hand, with criminal charges likely, the court will prioritize restitution to victims. On the other hand, the more victims there are, the less each might recover if the stolen funds have been spent or lost in failed investments. After Diane left, I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. My son wasn't just a son who had made a terrible mistake with his mother's money. He was a calculated financial criminal who had built a business model around exploiting the vulnerable. I should have seen it, I said finally. There were signs. The sudden upgrade in their lifestyle a few years ago. The way Corinne was always talking about their investment properties, but never showed photos or gave specific addresses. How could I have been so blind? Because you're his mother, Patricia said gently. We see what we expect to see in our children. And Elliot was always charming, always able to talk his way out of trouble. That night, alone in the guest room, I pulled out the small photo album I'd brought with me when I left Elliot's house. There he was at 5, grinning with a missing front tooth. At 12, proudly holding a science fair ribbon. At his college graduation, arm around my shoulders, Richard beaming on his other side. Where along the way had he learned that people were resources to be exploited rather than human beings to be respected? Had Richard and I emphasized financial success too much? Had we modeled materialistic values without realizing it? Or was it simpler than that? Had Elliot simply chosen the path of least resistance, of taking what he wanted regardless of who it hurt, because it was easier than earning it honestly? I closed the album, a weight of failure pressing down on me. Whatever the reason for Elliot's moral corruption, I couldn't change it now. All I could do was ensure he faced the consequences of his actions, even if that meant watching my only child potentially go to prison. The next morning brought a flurry of developments. Diane called to inform us that the search warrants were being executed at Elliot and Corinne's home and office. Local news outlets had gotten wind of the story, a prominent local realtor and her accountant husband under investigation for investment fraud. Patricia had to turn away 2 reporters who showed up at her door looking for a statement from me. By afternoon, the story had escalated. Elliot and Corinne had been taken in for questioning. Their computers and files had been seized. Investors were coming forward with similar stories of promised riches that never materialized. The scandal was growing by the hour. As I watched the news coverage from the safety of the Hadleys' home, a strange numbness settled over me. It was as if I were watching a movie about strangers, not the implosion of my own family. The doorbell rang around 4 o'clock. Robert answered it, then came to find me in the sunroom. "June, there's a young woman here asking to see you. Says her name is Zoe. She seems quite upset." Confused, I followed Robert to the entryway. Standing there was a young woman in her late 20s, clutching a toddler to her hip. Her eyes were red from crying, her expression a mixture of desperation and determination. "Mrs. Barrett? I'm Zoe Winters. This is my daughter Lily." She shifted the child, who buried her face shyly in her mother's shoulder. I'm one of the people your son and his wife defrauded. I lost everything." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. "How did you find me?" "One of the investigators mentioned you were staying with the Hadleys. I looked up the address." She swallowed hard. "I had to see you, to make you understand what they did to us. What your son did to us." Robert glanced at me uncertainly. I nodded, and he showed us to the living room. Once seated, Zoe's story poured out. A young widow, she had received a $350,000 life insurance payment after her husband's death in a construction accident. With a 2-year-old daughter to support, she had wanted to invest the money safely to provide for their future. "Corinne approached me at a grief support group," she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. She said she and her husband specialized in helping widows secure their financial futures. She was so understanding, so sympathetic. She said all the right things. Elliot and Corinne had convinced Zoe to invest her entire settlement in their premium lakefront development opportunity, the same project they had used my money to fund. They had promised 15% returns within the first year, enough to allow Zoe to stay home with her daughter instead of returning to work immediately. 6 months in, they told me there were unexpected environmental issues that had delayed the project but would be resolved soon. After a year, they said the market had shifted and returns would be lower than projected. 2 months ago, they stopped returning my calls completely. Zoe wiped angry tears from her eyes. "I had to move in with my parents. I had to take a night shift job at a call center because it's all I could find. My daughter barely sees me, and now I find out it was all a scam from the beginning. Shame washed over me. Shame that my son had done this to this young mother, to others like her. "I'm so sorry," I said, the words wholly inadequate. "Did you know?" Zoe asked bluntly. "Were you part of it?" "No," I replied, meeting her gaze directly. "I was another victim. They took nearly everything I had from selling my house after my husband died. When I discovered it, Elliot tried to have me declared incompetent." Zoe studied my face, seeming to search for truth or deception there. Whatever she saw appeared to satisfy her. "The investigators say we might get some money back, but not all of it. They've been living high on our investments, and a lot of the properties they claim to be developing don't even exist." My heart sank further. "I'm fighting to recover what I can. I promise you, I had no idea what they were doing." "I believe you," Zoe said finally. "You have the same look I see in the mirror, the look of someone who trusted the wrong person and is paying the price." She stood, shifting her daughter to her other hip. "I just needed you to know, to see one of the faces behind what your son did." After she left, I sat motionless, the full human cost of Elliot's crimes washing over me. It wasn't just numbers on a page. Investment accounts drained. It was a young mother working night shifts while her baby slept at her grandparents' house. It was elderly people finding their retirement savings gone. It was real people with real lives, devastated by my son's greed. That evening, as Patricia, Robert, and I were finishing a quiet dinner, the phone rang. Robert answered, his expression growing grave as he listened. When he hung up, he looked at me with sympathy. "That was my contact in the police department. Elliot and Corinne have been arrested. They're being charged with multiple counts of fraud, financial elder abuse, and operating a Ponzi scheme. They're in custody now." The news should have brought relief, perhaps even a grim satisfaction that justice was being served. Instead, it felt like the final death of something precious, the last shred of the relationship between mother and son, irrevocably severed by handcuffs and criminal charges. "There's more," Robert continued reluctantly. "Apparently, when they were arrested, Corinne became hysterical. She's been claiming that the entire scheme was Elliot's idea, that she was just following his instructions. They've been placed in separate holding cells because she was screaming accusations at him. So their united front had crumbled at the first sign of real consequences. Somehow, this betrayal of each other seemed a fitting end to a partnership built on deceiving others." I excused myself and went to the guest room, needing solitude to process what was happening. Through the window, I could see the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Somewhere across town, my son was in a jail cell, his wife in another, their house of cards collapsed entirely. And I was here, homeless in a technical sense, my financial future uncertain, my family destroyed. Yet despite everything, a strange sense of peace was beginning to emerge from the chaos. The truth, however painful, was finally exposed to the light. No more pretending, no more maintaining appearances, no more silent suffering. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Patricia entered, carrying a mug of chamomile tea. "I thought you might need this," she said, setting it on the nightstand. "Thank you." I managed a small smile. "For everything." She sat on the edge of the bed. "I've been thinking. Robert and I have that small garden apartment over the garage. It was meant for his mother, but she decided to stay in Arizona. It has its own entrance, a small kitchenette, bathroom. It's nothing fancy, but it's private and comfortable." "Patricia, I couldn't—" "You can," she interrupted firmly. "At least until you get back on your feet financially. The rent will be whatever you can afford. And before you worry about being a burden, consider this. I'd love having someone to consult on my research, and Robert would appreciate another scientist around to discuss ideas with." Tears welled in my eyes, unexpected and unstoppable. After months of being made to feel unwelcome, unwanted, and invisible in my own family, here was genuine kindness with no ulterior motive. "I don't know what to say," I whispered. "Say yes," Patricia replied simply. "Say yes, and tomorrow we'll start setting up your new home." Home. The word resonated in my chest. Not the house I had lost, not the basement prison I had escaped, but something new, a place where I would be valued and respected. "Yes," I said, the simple word feeling like a declaration of independence. As Patricia left me to my tea and thoughts, I realized that while the journey ahead would still be difficult, legal proceedings, financial reconstruction, the emotional aftermath of Elliot's betrayal, I was no longer alone in facing it. From the wreckage of what had been taken from me, I was salvaging something precious: my dignity, my autonomy, and the knowledge that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. Corinne's cruel words, "You eat like a beggar," had been meant to diminish me, to reinforce my status as unwanted and unworthy. Instead, they had become the catalyst for my liberation. In losing everything, I had found myself again. 6 months passed like the turning of seasons, gradually, then suddenly complete. The garden apartment above the Hadley's garage became my sanctuary, a place to heal and rebuild. I filled it with potted herbs and small flowering plants, transforming the space into something that was uniquely mine. The legal proceedings moved with the glacial pace typical of our justice system. Elliot and Corinne's case had grown from local scandal to statewide news as more victims came forward. The final count revealed they had defrauded 14 people of nearly $2.4 million through their property investment scheme. Most victims were elderly, widowed, or otherwise vulnerable, carefully selected targets unlikely to ask too many technical questions or demand immediate returns. Elliot accepted a plea deal: 7 years in state prison, 5 years probation afterward, and a court order to pay restitution to all victims. Corinne, maintaining she was merely following her husband's instructions, received a lighter sentence of 3 years. Their marriage dissolved in a bitter divorce conducted through lawyers while both were in custody. The most painful day was my court-mandated victim impact statement. Standing at the podium in the hushed courtroom, I looked at my son in his prison jumpsuit, his expression a mixture of shame and resentment. "I taught science for 38 years, I began, my voice steadier than I expected. "I always emphasize to my students that actions have consequences. In ecosystems, in chemistry, in human lives, the natural world operates on cause and effect, not intentions or excuses." Elliot wouldn't meet my eyes as I continued. "The consequences of your actions extend far beyond the money you took. You stole people's security, their dignity, their futures. You stole my home, my independence, and my trust. But the greatest loss is what you've done to yourself, the person you could have been, should have been." The judge ordered maximum restitution, but the reality was sobering. Much of the stolen money had been spent on luxury items that depreciated rapidly or lost in genuinely bad investments. After liquidating all their assets, including the house where I had once occupied the basement, the recovery amounted to roughly 30 cents on the dollar. For me, it meant approximately $115,000 returned from my original $387,000. Enough to start over modestly, but not the comfortable retirement Richard and I had planned. For victims like Zoe, the young widow, it meant similar partial recovery of funds desperately needed. What emerged from the wreckage, unexpectedly, was community. The victims of Elliot and Corinne's scheme began meeting regularly, first to share information about the legal proceedings, then to offer mutual support as we all rebuilt our lives. We created an informal network for sharing resources, job opportunities, affordable housing leads, information about assistance programs. Zoe and her daughter Lily became regular visitors to my apartment. I helped with childcare while Zoe attended night classes to become a paralegal, specializing in fraud cases. Other victims included a retired schoolteacher like myself, a former nurse, a carpenter who had invested his workers' compensation settlement, ordinary people whose trust had been weaponized against them. Together, we turned our collective experience into action, establishing a community education program about financial fraud targeting seniors. I found myself speaking at senior centers and community colleges, sharing my story and warning signs of exploitation. The biology teacher in me had found a new classroom, a new purpose. My relationship with Elliot remained severed. He sent one letter from prison, a rambling mix of justifications and half-apologies that never directly acknowledged the harm he had caused. I recognized the hollow words as the same ones he had used to manipulate me and others for years. I didn't respond. Today marks exactly 1 year since I walked out of Elliot's house with nothing but a suitcase and determination. I'm sitting in my small garden patio outside the apartment, watching butterflies visit the native flowers I've planted in containers. At 66, I'm not where I expected to be at this stage of life. I'm working part-time at a local garden center to supplement my reduced retirement funds, sharing transportation with other seniors since I can't afford a car, carefully budgeting every expense. Yet despite these challenges, I've found an unexpected contentment. My world is smaller, but more authentic. My friendships are deeper, forged in the crucible of shared adversity rather than social convenience. I'm respected for my knowledge and experience, not dismissed as irrelevant due to my age. Patricia and Robert have become the family I chose rather than the one I lost. Zoe and Lily bring youth and energy into my life. My fellow fraud survivors provide understanding that even well-meaning friends cannot fully offer. This morning, I received a letter from the prosecutor's office. Corinne is being released early for good behavior and cooperation in other fraud cases. Elliot remains in prison, his appeals exhausted. The news stirred complex emotions, not renewed anger, as I might have expected, but a calm acceptance. Their power over my life is gone. Their cruelty, that cutting remark that I eat like a beggar, has been transformed from a weapon of humiliation into the catalyst for my liberation. I think often of the lessons I taught my biology students about adaptation and resilience. How organisms that survive catastrophic changes in their environments do so not by clinging to what was lost, but by finding new ways to thrive in altered circumstances. At 66, I've become living proof of my own teachings. The garden center where I work has asked me to develop a workshop series on medicinal plants and sustainable gardening, a perfect blend of my professional knowledge and personal passion. My victim impact statement has been incorporated into training materials for law enforcement on elder financial abuse. The apartment above the garage now feels truly like home, filled with plants, books, and evidence of a life being lived with purpose. I am not the same woman who meekly moved into her son's basement, grateful for whatever scraps of attention and respect were tossed her way. That woman disappeared the moment I walked out the door, choosing dignity over security, truth over comfortable lies. In the distance, a storm is gathering over the Green Mountains. I watch it approach without fear. I have weathered worse and emerged stronger. Whatever comes next, I am ready. If you've experienced something similar to my story, know that you're not alone. Reach out for help. There are people waiting to support you. If this resonated with you, please subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and transformation. Your comments mean the world to me.